Welcome to the neighborhood. Mrs. Daisy's voice chimed with forced cheerfulness, her smile stretching a little too wide across her face. She clutched a basket of freshly baked cookies, the sweet scent floating in the air around her. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson exchanged a hopeful glance. "Thank you, Mrs. Daisy," Mrs. Jackson said, her own smile genuine as she took the basket. "We're so happy to be here." Their young daughter, Jasmine, peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, curiosity shimmering in her eyes. "I'm Jasmine," she said shyly, extending a small hand. Mrs. Daisy took it with a gentle squeeze. "And what a lovely name it is. We don't see many new faces around here, especially not like yours. This is quite the change, isn't it?" Her words hung in the air, the syrupy sweetness belying a hint of something less welcoming. The Jacksons' new home stood out like a freshly painted canvas in a museum of fading watercolors. The vibrant shade of blue contrasted sharply with the muted tones of the surrounding houses. It was a declaration of their arrival, a symbol of their hopes and dreams. Mrs. Daisy's eyes lingered on the unpacked moving van, the cardboard boxes spilling over with untold stories of their previous life. "We've lived here for over 50 years, she said, her voice filled with the weight of her words. "It's a quiet place, mostly. People keep to themselves." Mrs. Jackson nodded politely, while Mr. Jackson looked around, his eyes lingering on the neatly trimmed hedges and the pristine lawns. "We're looking forward to getting to know everyone," he said, a hint of determination in his voice. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. The children, Jasmine and Kevin, explored their new school with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson tried to make small talk with the neighbors, who mostly offered polite nods and half-hearted smiles. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with strokes of orange and pink, Mr. Jackson washed the moving dust from their car. The neighbor's son, Timmy, pedaled by on his bike, slowing down to gawk at the unfamiliar faces. "Hi," Kevin called out, a basketball tucked under his arm. Timmy's eyes widened, and he skidded to a halt. "You're the new kid," he said, the curiosity in his voice unmasked. "Kevin," he introduced himself, tossing the ball into the air. "Wanna shoot some hoops?" Timmy looked at his mother, who hovered in the doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She offered a tight smile and a nod. "Be home by dinner," she called out before retreating into the house. The boys played until the streetlights flickered on, their laughter echoing through the quiet street. As they parted ways, Kevin felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make this place their home. But as the days grew longer and the nights grew warmer, the Jacksons began to notice a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the season. It was subtle at first, a cold shoulder at the grocery store, a turn back at the park, whispers that grew silent when they approached. Mrs. Daisy's smile remained, but it was like a mask that slipped a little more each day, revealing the stark contours of her true feelings. One afternoon, Jasmine and Kevin returned from school to find a hand-scrawled note tucked under their front door. It was anonymous, filled with hateful words that burned into their hearts like a brand. They didn't dare tell their parents, not wanting to dull the excitement of their new life with the stain of reality. Yet reality had a way of seeping in. At the school's parent-teacher night, Mrs. Daisy whispered to her friends, her eyes sliding to the Jacksons with a look that could curdle milk. The whispers grew into murmurs, and the Jacksons felt the weight of accusations that had no basis in truth. Determined not to let the hostility win, Mrs. Jackson decided to host a neighborhood potluck. She hoped that by bringing everyone together, they could bridge the growing divide. The invitations went out, and to their surprise, almost everyone RSVP'd with a positive response. On the night of the party, their house was filled with the aroma of diverse dishes and the sound of tentative laughter. Mrs. Daisy arrived with a casserole, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for a reason to be offended. But as the evening went on, the neighbors began to mingle, sharing stories and finding common ground. The party was in full swing when the wail of sirens pierced the air, cutting through the laughter like a knife. Red and blue lights danced across the walls as a police car screeched to a halt outside their home. The doorbell rang, and Mr. Jackson's heart sank as he saw the officers' stern faces through the peephole. Mrs. Daisy had called the police, claiming a disturbance. The officers looked around at the peaceful gathering, then at Mrs. Daisy, who shrank back into the shadows of her own porch. The tension was palpable, a tangible force that wrapped itself around every guest. The police spoke with Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, their voices measured and calm. They assured the family that it was just a misunderstanding and that they'd be leaving shortly. The neighbors hovered, a mix of shock and pity etched on their faces. The Jacksons knew that Mrs. Daisy's spite had gone too far, and the whispers of doubt grew louder. As the officers left, the party guests began to drift away, the warmth of their welcome replaced by the cold shoulder of fear. The Jackson family stood in their doorway, watching their dreams of acceptance retreat down the street with each departing car. The aftermath of the party was a tumult of emotion. The children were scared, their eyes wide with the realization that not everyone in their new home was as welcoming as Timmy had been. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson were furious, their hearts heavy with the burden of a fight they hadn't chosen. But as they sat in their living room, surrounded by the remnants of the shattered welcome, they made a pact. They would not be driven out by Mrs. Daisy's bigotry. They would stand firm, hold their heads high, and show their children that love and courage could conquer hate. The Jacksons knew that the road ahead was fraught with challenges, but they were ready to face them. They had each other, and together, they could turn their house into a bastion of light in a neighborhood that had grown too comfortable in the shadows of the past. The next day, Mr. Jackson approached Timmy's father, Mr. Thompson, as he was mowing his lawn. "I know what happened last night," he said, his voice steady. "We're not going anywhere." Mr. Thompson paused, his eyes meeting Mr. Jackson's. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I didn't know she'd go that far." A flicker of understanding passed between them. It was a small victory, but it was a start. The Jacksons had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of some of their neighbors, and it was beginning to take root. Mrs. Jackson turned to the community center, where she proposed a series of workshops and gatherings aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding. It was a bold move, one that made Mrs. Daisy's cheeks redden with rage. But slowly, the tide began to turn. The neighborhood watched as the Jacksons turned the negative energy into something positive. Mrs. Jackson's proposal for community events was met with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. But she remained unflappable, her smile as bright as the sunflowers in her garden. The first event was a potluck dinner with a twist. Each family was to bring a dish that represented their cultural heritage. Mrs. Daisy spread rumors that the Jacksons were trying to force their ways on everyone, but the curiosity was stronger than the fear. The night of the potluck, a decent number of neighbors showed up, each with a dish to share. The room was filled with the aroma of spices from around the globe, and the sounds of unfamiliar languages blended with the clinking of silverware and plates. Mrs. Daisy's absence was notable, but her son, Timmy, slipped in with a plate of his mother's famous chocolate chip cookies. His eyes searched for Kevin, and the two boys shared a look that conveyed more than words could. The party was a success, with families sharing stories and finding common ground over their shared love for food and community. Weeks turned into months, and the Jacksons continued to host events. Each time, the number of attendees grew. The neighborhood started to see them not as outsiders, but as a family who cared deeply about unity. Mrs. Daisy's influence began to wane as more people saw the beauty in diversity. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson found a bouquet of daisies on their porch with a small note. It read, "Welcome home." It was from Mrs. Peterson, a quiet neighbor who had initially kept her distance. The gesture was small, but it was a powerful symbol that the tides were changing. As the seasons shifted, the neighborhood saw a transformation. The children played together without prejudice, and the adults began to see beyond the color of each other's skin. The Jacksons' perseverance had cracked the foundation of Mrs. Daisy's prejudiced kingdom, allowing the seeds of acceptance to take root. But the battle was not over. Mrs. Daisy's resentment grew like a weed in the garden of progress. She waited for her moment to strike, and when it came, it was as unexpected as it was cruel. During a town hall meeting about the community's future, she stood up and spoke with a quiver in her voice, claiming that the Jacksons were a danger to their way of life. The room was silent, all eyes on the Jackson family. But instead of shrinking, they stood tall. Mr. Jackson took the microphone, his voice firm yet calm. "We are not a threat, Mrs. Daisy," he said. "We are your neighbors. We are your community. We are here to stay." The room erupted into applause, drowning out Mrs. Daisy's protests. The family felt the weight of the neighborhood support, and their resolve grew stronger. They knew that every day would not be easy, but they were ready to face the storms together. The story of the Jacksons' integration into the neighborhood became a beacon of hope for others facing similar struggles. Their strength and resilience inspired change, not just in their own lives, but in the hearts of those around them. And as the neighborhood grew more vibrant with every passing day, Mrs. Daisy's bitterness was slowly forgotten, overshadowed by the beauty of a community that had chosen to grow together rather than apart.